Our third talk this morning is titled Church History, How to Answer the Lies Against the Catholic Church. Our speaker is the rector of the seminary at the City of Mary, Mary Immaculate Queen Church. He has been the pastor there for quite a few years. Having been ordained, I think it was probably one of the first ordinations I ever saw, maybe when I was in second grade, and is quite the instrument Our Lady uses to make sure that we are able to have the conference. I'd like to please ask you to welcome to the lectern Father Benedict Hughes.
Thank you, Father. Before we get started on the conference talk here, the lecture on church history, Father asked me to convey what I knew of Father Ephraim Marie Cordova's progress. He was operated on Monday. That was a Feast of the Holy Rosary, a 4-hour operation to remove a little deposit of blood in his brain, which was causing seizures. And so the operation was a success. He is progressing, getting rest and pain meds for swelling that increases until day 3. Well, today would be day 3. Doing some therapy in good spirits. So please remember him in your prayers for continued progress and health. Now, this lecture is on church history. And in particular, we will go into the misrepresentation of the Catholic Church regarding various historical events. So it has to do with church history, and let's begin by asking, why would we study church history? We have there on the slide different reasons why we would study church history. It gives us a frame for unifying all historical knowledge in Him, who is the central figure of history, Jesus Christ, etc. But I want to especially highlight the third and fourth elements. By studying church history, we have a better understanding of the church herself, and that is she is a divine institution made up of human members, and we keep those two ideas separate. And also, the study of church history provides us with principles to properly understand the problems of our own day, and in particular, for this lecture, it provides us with the material to defend the church and answer the lies against her. This lecture has to do with the science of apologetics. Apologetics is a study of the faith, and part of the study of the faith is learning how to defend the reputation of the Catholic Church against the many lies that have been spread about her. Now, you might be wondering why I use the term lie. A lie is still a lie, even those who repeat it are not aware that it's a lie. So, textbooks, history books just take it for granted that, for instance, the Inquisition was a time of horrible torture and murder of thousands upon thousands of innocent persons by the Catholic Church, etc. And so people believe it because it's repeated over and over. So a lie, again, is still a lie, even though those who repeat it are not aware of its mendacity. Why were these lies started in the first place? Oftentimes, it's the third reason, anti-Catholic sentiment, but not exclusively. There might be a political angle, and we'll get to that when we talk about what is called the Black Legend, which is promoted in England, that Spain, at the time of the Reformation, was a country of barbaric savages, etc. That there were political reasons behind that, sometimes economic, but different reasons behind the promotion of lies. We could also call these false ideas of history myths. What is a myth? The dictionary gives several definitions of a myth, but I would like to go to the fourth one. A myth, actually the third one up there on the top of the second column. A myth is an unfounded or false notion. So ideas that have been spread and just become the conventional wisdom. As Catholics, we must never be embarrassed by the history of the Catholic Church, even those episodes of history that are indefensible. They do not denigrate the Church, but rather illustrate her divine guidance, namely, that the Church has weathered the storm, scandal, heresy, and the Church still stands. So again, we must not be embarrassed by true history. In this lecture, we will study some episodes and or periods of church history that have been grossly misrepresented in order that we might understand the true history of these periods and have a base of knowledge to defend the Church against the lies that are spread about her. Uh-oh, what did I do? It froze up. I need my technical help. I didn't do this, this is, what would we do without seminarians to help out? It's not advancing. I must have accidentally hit something. So the next slide will be the 8 topics that I've chosen to cover in this presentation. And there are certainly many more, but these are 8 episodes or periods of church history that have been grossly misrepresented. First of all, myths about early Christianity. And by the way, we'll cover these in more or less a chronological period in which they occurred. Also, the so-called suppressed Gospels. Third, what are called the Dark Ages. Fourth, the Crusades, then the Inquisition, the so-called Black Legend. And then the 7th one, supposed opposition to scientific progress on the part of the Church. And the last one, the terrible lie about Pope Pius XII. So again, in a more or less chronological way, the first lie, that the early Christians believed nothing like we Roman Catholics believe today. So this legend is that the early Christians were, I'll read here, the most thoroughgoing and persistent religious historical lie seems to be the oddly unhistorical view that most Protestants take of pre-Reformation history. They posit an early Christian community of believers with a very loose ecclesiastical organization and no fixed hierarchical structure, only a couple of sacraments and a few doctrines that fit whichever sect they belong to. This happy situation lasted in their minds until the Emperor Constantine stopped the persecutions and legitimized Christianity. Constantine supposedly reshaped the structure and doctrines of the church by meddling in ecclesiastical affairs, and this church-state coziness changed Roman Catholicism into what became the bad Catholic Church we have today, while the true believers went underground in order to practice their pure and simple faith, only emerging into daylight with the dawn of the Reformation. So again, that's the lie. How would we respond? Our response is that there is a vast amount of historical data that demonstrates that early Christians believed in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, they prayed for the dead, and in general held to all the beliefs that we as Catholics hold dear today. The next lie, that the Catholic Church suppressed writings that did not fit in with her teachings. So this has to do with censorship. And the irony is that today, modern leftists and liberals are the ones that are supremely guilty of censorship, trying to stop and suppress any view that does not accord with their beliefs. Now, there has been some censorship in the history of the Catholic Church. There's censorship in homes. Parents don't allow their children to read or watch anything they want. So censorship is not a bad thing when properly used, etc. And there's a very interesting story in the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 19, verse 19, about St. Paul's visit to Ephesus. He spent 2 years there. And as a result of his teaching, many of the Ephesians were converted to Christianity, and they of their own accord brought their books on witchcraft, writings, Gnostic writings, etc. They brought all these things and piled them up in the city and burned them. So that is a sort of censorship which was, of course, approved by St. Paul. But what are those so-called lost gospels or suppressed gospels? In 1945, there was a discovery in a small village in Egypt of fragments of writings in clay pots. You've also heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls, so something similar. Now, these fragments were from gospels or supposed gospels that were not unknown to the early church fathers. In fact, St. Irenaeus was one of the fathers who particularly denounced these writings, which were actually Gnostic writings. So imagine after Constantine legalized the practice of Christianity, allowed Christianity to spread unhindered, that these various books that had been inspired by the Holy Ghost were brought together to be put together into the Bible as we have it. A judgment needed to be made regarding which books were inspired and which were not. And there were supposed Gospels of St. Thomas, Mary Magdalene, and of all people, Judas Iscariot. So there were various other writings which the church, under the inspiration of the Holy Ghost, determined were not authentic scripture, were not inspired by God, and those were obviously excluded from the canon of the Bible that was put together by Pope St. Damasus, whose secretary was a man named Jerome, St. Jerome. So these writings that were found in 1945 were actually sections of these condemned gospels, or excluded, so-called excluded gospels. Now, all of these writings that were determined by the church to be non-scriptural were Gnostic writings. And if you know anything about Gnosticism, it had come from the East at the early centuries of Christianity, and it posited a good God and an evil God. And there's this constant warfare. And Gnosticism has reappeared at various points in history. So you've heard of the Albigensian heresy. That was just a revival of ancient Gnosticism. So here are some of the common themes in the condemned Gospels that were Gnostic. Number one, the world and everything in it is totally corrupt because it was created by an inferior and utterly evil renegade godling. Number two, the creation was but the bizarre plaything of this satanic rebel, a depraved spiritual power who is without any redeeming virtues. This evil God is worshipped by the Jews, this is what Gnostics believed, who are thereby an accursed people, and conventional Christians have been falling into the same trap. The fourth idea of Gnosticism, that Jesus is not the son of this evil creature, but is a teacher or sage, a spiritual being having the mystical powers needed to penetrate this dreadful fraud. And finally, because the material world is utterly corrupt, extreme asceticism, including celibacy, is the only option. So again, a good God and an evil God, and this theme of Gnosticism has persisted down through the centuries, at least up until the 13th century. The next lie we go into is that the Catholic Church is responsible for the so-called Dark Ages. Now, if you're a student of history, you know that Western civilization, we recognize various epochs or periods. So you have the Roman Empire, and after the fall of the Roman Empire, there was the beginning of what has been called the Dark Ages, which lasted roughly up until the Reformation. Until the Renaissance. And the Renaissance then was followed by the Reformation. But let me ask you, who created the term the Dark Ages? See if you know. The term for that segment of history called the Dark Ages was invented by the enlightened ones who called their movement the Enlightenment. And they followed the Reformation in the 17th and 18th centuries, especially in France and in England. One of the principal promoters of the Enlightenment was a man named Voltaire. Voltaire spoke about the Catholic Church as the accursed thing, the Catholic Church. He was a baptized Catholic. His name was Francis Marie Arouet, and he renamed himself Voltaire and became one of the most bitter anti-Catholic writers of the Enlightenment. But it was these philosophers of the Enlightenment who called that period the Dark Ages. And their idea of the Dark Ages was that it was a time of backwardness. It was a time of lack of progress in society, where people were living very backward lives because the church was suppressing progress. And that's a common theme of these various lies, that the church has always tried to suppress scientific progress. So how would we answer these ideas of the Catholic Church promoting backward views? What many historians refer to the Dark Ages were really not so dark after all. True, the mass migration of tribes from the East into Western Europe resulted in catastrophic problems for society. But the church met these challenges with teaching, especially by the monks in monasteries. The myth of the Dark Ages was created by the intellectuals of the Enlightenment. And we're going to get into the monks and what they accomplished. But one of the things we need to keep in mind about history is when did the Roman Empire fall? Or what is the date given for the end of the Roman Empire? The date is given of 476 AD, because that is when a barbarian, Ostrogoth, I think, Alisar was it, who took over, dethroned the last Roman emperor, and himself took over the Roman Empire, governing the Roman Empire. So that's given as the date for the fall of the Roman Empire. It didn't end, it was just taken over by different powers. But there were all of these waves of migration from the East into Europe. Why? Because the Roman Empire had allowed for greater progress. There were roads, there was communication, there was commerce, there were fields, good farms, etc. And so these tribes from the East wanted that, and they came one after the other. You've heard of the Huns and the Goths and the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths and the Vandals and so on and so forth. So this challenge to the society of Western Europe had to be met, and it was met by the monks in the monasteries primarily. So let me read to you a little bit about this so-called Dark Ages. The notion that Europe fell into the Dark Ages was a hoax perpetrated by the very anti-religious intellectuals such as Voltaire and Gibbon, who were determined to claim that theirs was the era of enlightenment. Another factor was that intellectuals too often have no interest in anything but literary matters. It is quite true that after the fall of Rome, educated Europeans did not write nearly as elegant Latin as had the best Roman writers. I'll skip past that part on literature. Another component contributing to the myth of the Dark Ages was that in this era, there were no longer large cities having hundreds of thousands of residents. So again, a complete change had taken over Europe as a result of this mass migration. So the monks in the monasteries really were responsible for civilization in Western Europe during the so-called Dark Ages. What did they accomplish? First of all, the preservation of classical works, works by Plato, Aristotle, and so many others. Monks would spend hours in a room in the monastery called a scriptorium copying. Obviously, this was before the invention of the printing press, so recopying these classical works. The teaching methods of agriculture and husbandry were promoted by the monks. Also feeding the poor, especially at times of famine. Monastic schools promoted learning. The monks fostered, and the church fostered, art, music, and architecture. I want to come back to music a little bit later. And also think about the magnificent cathedrals and many works of art during the so-called Dark Ages. So monasticism in Europe owes its foundation to Saint Benedict, who was born in the year 480, 4 years after the fall of the Roman Empire. After living as a recluse for 3 years, he began to found monasteries, for which he wrote a rule. The ingenious rule of Saint Benedict provided the stability that allowed men and women to leave the world, sanctify themselves in the cloister, and give back to society through works of education and charity. The success of the monastic system cannot be overstated. I was trying to find it, I wasn't successful at finding it, but during the Dark Ages, how many monasteries were there in Europe? I read before there were more than 10,000 monasteries in Western Europe during the so-called Dark Ages. Some of them smaller, some of them large, even like cities. But the rule, again, of St. Benedict was ingenious in that each monastery was autonomous and had an explanation for the way of life. And you think about monasticism, thousands and thousands of monks leaving the world, giving their lives to God, and because they were celibate, they didn't have families to provide for, so they were able, in addition to prayer, to dedicate their times to cultivating the land, producing fruit by which they helped the poor, and again, promoting learning, etc. So monasticism was a tremendous means by which Europe was civilized during the so-called Dark Ages. Now, some of the accomplishments of the Middle Ages, again, the so-called Dark Ages. First of all, I mentioned music. Did you know that the ancient Romans and Greeks, which were the ideal for the enlightened ones of the Enlightenment, they did not know how to sing in parts. Singing a harmony in addition to the melody, what we would call polyphony, didn't exist before the year 900 or thereabouts, and it was due to the church, this progress in music. And there was a monk who lived around the year 1000 who invented the staff. So those of you who play a musical instrument are very familiar with the staff, the treble or bass clefs and notes. Before this monk lived, there was no way of communicating to another how to sing a particular composition. The person would have to hear you sing it and memorize it, and then he or she would know that piece of music. So this monk invented the staff, which allowed a composition to be written down and then given to someone else miles away who had never heard it, and he or she could reproduce it because of the staff. But again, that was a monk. In fact, the syllables, do, re, mi, come from the hymn from Vespers for the Feast of St. John the Baptist, because this monk noticed that they progressively were the scales, the major scales. So he came up with that system, and that's where we owe those syllables, do, re, mi, fa, so, etc., to a monk who used it from a church hymn. So again, the Catholic Church promoting music. Art and architecture. Before the 1200s, there was no painting on canvas. Painting was on wood or stone, and it was again, Catholic artists that came up with the idea of canvas and painting. The Gothic architecture, that would be a whole lecture in itself. What's interesting is today we can't even reproduce what the great builders of the Middle Ages made with these magnificent cathedrals and their incredible advancements in technology and engineering, the flying buttresses, which allowed taller walls and thinner walls, and also allowed for the creation of stained glass. So many inventions that are from the Catholic Church. Literature, again, writing used to be in Latin, and it was in the Middle Ages that finally, through the civilization of Europe, these various tribes settled down, they learned how to read and write and develop farming skills, etc. And over time, you had writing that developed in the different languages. So French, for example, didn't exist until about the 1200s. And it was a great writer named Dante who wrote the first work that we know of in what would be modern Italian. So the modern languages of Europe come from Catholic writers. Also education. The first two universities in existence were in Paris and Bologna in the middle of the 12th century. I want to read a short section on science. Again, there's this conventional belief, conventional wisdom, that science was basically dead until we get to the Enlightenment, or at least the Reformation, and that the peoples before were very backward. But it was the church. Well, I'll just read here. Just as there were no dark ages, there was no scientific revolution. Rather, the notion of a scientific revolution was invented to discredit the medieval church by claiming that science burst forth in full bloom, thus owing no debt to prior scholastic scholars, only when a weakened Christianity no longer could suppress it. But as will be seen, the great scientific achievements of the 16th and 17th centuries were produced by a group of scholars, notable for their piety, who were based in Christian universities and whose brilliant achievements were carefully built upon an invaluable legacy of centuries of brilliant scholastic scholarship. The next lie would be about the Crusades. Again, we're going in a fairly chronological order. So the lie is that the Crusades were actually this greedy, bloodthirsty group of Europeans who went and invaded the poor, peaceful Muslims around the Holy Land and butchered them because they wanted more land, this imperialistic desire, etc. So how would we answer that about the Crusades? I will quote here from an author. I'm going to give you the source of these books at the end of the lecture, but this is a great book on answering these lies. 2 months after the attack on New York City, 9/11, 2001, former President Bill Clinton informed an audience at Georgetown University that, quote, "Those of us who come from various European lineages are not blameless." So he was saying that the reason for the attacks on the Twin Towers, etc., was because Christians had gone to the Holy Land in the 11th century. And that's a common belief, that there was this residual resentment over what the Crusades had done that sparked these attacks on the United States and others. During the 20th century, a anti-Catholic writer from France, Gibbon, developed a thesis into a quite elaborate materialist account of why the Crusades took place. He summed up that the Crusades alleviated a severe financial squeeze on Europeans, Europe's knightly class. According to these modern historians, at this time there was a substantial and rapidly growing number of surplus sons, members of noble families who would not inherit and who were unable to receive even modest incomes from their family. Hence, the Crusades, this is a quote from one of these historians, the crusade acted as a kind of safety valve for the knightly class, a class which looked upon the crusade as a way of solving its material problems. The whole reason for the Crusades is these sons of noble families that thought, well, my older brother is going to inherit the farm, so what am I going to do? So they got together and they went to, to the Holy Land to conquer. So our response would be that the Crusades were Christian pilgrims, had been assaulted, robbed, and even killed by Muslims. In addition, Christian churches had been desecrated. The Crusaders sought to recover the Holy Land, which had been forcibly taken away from Christians by Muslim forces, and to provide safety for Christian pilgrims traveling to these sacred spots. The Crusades were started by Pope Urban II. And he gave an inspired speech in Clermont, France in November of 1095. And it's interesting, you want to really understand the motive, you would have to read the speech. I've got sections of it here. But the point is, there was this zealous desire to safeguard pilgrims going to the Holy Land and to recover the holy places. And the Crusades were started by the Emperor of Constantinople, or at least a letter that he wrote. Now, keep in mind that the East was now in schism. As of 1053, the Greek Church had split from Rome, and there was the Eastern Schism. But this was in around the year 1095, or close to that the Emperor Alexius Comnenus, Emperor of Byzantium, wrote from his embattled capital to the Count of Flanders. Now, Flanders would be in what is now Belgium. So he wrote to the Count of Flanders requesting that this count and his fellow Christians in the West come to the rescue. In his letter, the emperor detailed gruesome tortures of pilgrims and vile desecrations of churches, altars, and baptismal fonts. Should Constantinople fall to the Turks, not only would thousands more Christians be murdered, tortured, and raped, but, quote, the most holy relics of the Savior, gathered over the centuries, would be lost. Therefore, and this is his words in the letter, the Emperor of the East, therefore, in the name of God, we implore you to bring to this city all the faithful soldiers of Christ. In your coming, you will find your reward in heaven, and if you do not come, God will condemn you. So this is what the Emperor of the East wrote to this leader in the West. Well, that letter then was sent to the Pope, and the Pope was very inspired by this letter and wanted to do something about it. Now, the Crusades were also a way of bringing about peace in Western Europe, because these petty rulers would often fight among themselves, a constant problem for the church. And so this was uniting everyone in a common cause to rescue the sacred places in the Holy Land. So I have more on the Crusades, but in the interest of time, I want to move on. But that is an important topic for us to understand, that it has been grossly misrepresented. And there were some individual Crusader knights who went and looted or killed, but by far the evils that were being committed by especially the Seljuk Turks. Matter of fact, I want to read a little bit about that if I can find it. This book gives the sermon of Pope Urban II, which is quite inspiring, but I won't look for it right now. But he's talking about the group that had taken over in the middle of the 11th century the area of the East, and they were just brutal. If any Christians survived from a pilgrimage to the Holy Land to tell the tale in Europe, they had been robbed, beaten, many of them were sold into slavery, etc. So again, is a very different story than what is oftentimes presented. All right, we move on. The fifth lie: the Inquisition was a bloody and cruel attempt by the Catholic Church to persecute anyone who did not support her teachings and practices. What was the Inquisition? The Inquisition was a sort of court that was started by the Catholic Church in Italy and then later on in Spain, and it was for the purpose of weeding out heresies. But the Inquisition, operated by the Church, especially friars of the mendicant orders, Dominicans, Franciscans, they never condemned anyone to death. The condemnation to death was done by civil authorities. And we have to understand, when there were executions in those ages, that church and state were one, not like what we're used to. To understand history properly, you'd have to go back and try to recreate what life was like in those times. So someone who was a heretic was also undermining the peace of civil society. So how would we respond? The Inquisition was set up to root out heresy and to detect false conversions. It was organized by friars of the mendicant orders, who would then turn over the guilty to secular authorities. So here's a question for you. I'll stay on that slide for a minute. How many people do you think were put to death during the Inquisition? So let me find some statistics here. This is a great book I'll tell you about later. There was, at least in Spain, what was called an auto de fe, which was not an execution, but was a public avowal of the faith. The inquisitors were far more concerned with repentance than with punishment. And therefore, an auto de fe consisted of a public appearance by persons convicted of various sins who offered public confessions of their guilt and were thereby reconciled to the church. Only very, very rarely did an auto de fe end with the offender being surrendered to civil authorities for execution. The Inquisition did not ever conduct an actual execution. Even so, autos de fe were not frequent. In the city of Toledo, between 1575 and 1610, 35 years, only 12 autos de fe were held, at which 386 culprits appeared. Obviously, then, the tales of weekly mass burnings all across Spain are malicious fantasies. So how many actually did die, especially during the Spanish Inquisition, because that's the one that is particularly maligned. The first 50 years of the Inquisition's operation in Spain are poorly documented, but historians now agree that these were its bloodiest days, and that perhaps as many as 1,500 people may have been executed, or about 30 a year. Turning to the fully recorded period of the 44,674 cases, only 826 people were executed, which amounts to 1.8% of those brought to trial. All told, during the entire period 1480 through 1700, only about 10 deaths per year were meted out by the Inquisition all across Spain. A small fraction of the many thousands of Lutherans, Lollards, and Catholics, in addition to two of his wives, that Henry VIII is credited with having boiled, burned, beheaded, or hanged. During the subsequent century, 1530 to 1630, the English averaged 750 hangings a year, many of them for minor thefts. In contrast, the few who were sentenced to death by the Spanish Inquisition were usually repeat offenders who would not repent. And there's a very interesting story in here about the prisons of the Spanish Inquisition, that they were so comfortable that there were some persons who would commit crimes in hopes of getting put into the Spanish prisons. Very different from the Black Legend. So I mentioned the Black Legend, and that's what we want to get into next. And that is this idea promoted by the Protestants in England that Spain was a country of just barbaric, backward, brutal savages, etc. And it was promoted for a number of reasons because of the envy on the part of the English of the success of the Spanish explorers who had settled most of the New World, the various colonies in America. And also because in the 16th century, as you know, England had turned Protestant. And so there was this antipathy to Spain. In fact, who was Henry's lawful wife? Catherine of Aragon. She was from Spain. And you know about the Spanish Armada and all of that at the time of Elizabeth, so-called Good Queen Bess. You know, the English refer to Queen Mary, who is the only lawful descendant of Henry VIII, the daughter of Queen Catherine and King Henry. She was queen for only 5 years, but she was a Catholic who restored Catholicism. Elizabeth hated her. Once Catherine had passed away, Elizabeth became the queen. She promised Philip, he was the husband of Mary, Philip II of Spain, and the Queen Mary. She promised that she would not persecute Catholics, that the Catholic faith would be allowed to remain in England, but as soon as she became queen, she went back on her promise. And what is interesting is she delighted to read the accounts of Topcliffe, who was her main executioner, on how he executed the English Catholics that were put to death. And I want to see if I can find that, because it's an amazing quote that I just want to give you a little bit of a different history here. Queen Elizabeth I enjoyed reading the nauseating accounts of her notorious torturer, Topcliffe, an expert in inflicting suffering on his victims, particularly Catholics. It was said that during Elizabeth's reign, the rack was never silent, as the English Catholic martyrs could testify. The English custom of hanging, drawing, and quartering a condemned person combined execution with prolonged torture. Horses often drew the victim through the streets to the place of execution, where he was hanged until he was almost but not quite dead. Then he was cut down, disemboweled, and his entrails boiled in a kettle before his eyes. Sometimes he was then tied to 4 horses that were set off in different directions, thus pulling apart what was left of him. I know of no account of the Catholic Inquisition that can top that for cruelty. So much for the cruel Inquisition. There's a lot more here that I don't have time to read about the Inquisition. In modern books, history books, how many were executed? Some say 150,000. Others go on, and one person even says 3 million. And they don't, of course, give any footnotes, it's just purely conjecture. And it's much less. And that was done by civil authorities, again. Okay, we proceed then to the 6th lie, that the Spanish were a cruel and brutal people who sought to subjugate and despoil the Native Americans through conquest, and their only motive was lust for power and greed. This is what is called by historians the Black Legend. It was propagated by England during the time of the Reformation. Motives were various, such as an envy of Spain's seafaring prowess and her success in discovery, and especially due to the anti-Catholic sentiment of England during the time of the Reformation. We've already spoken about that adequately. So we move on to the 7th lie, and this is that the Catholic Church has always opposed scientific progress. What is the truth? Modern scientific discoveries were only possible due to the progress of previous ages. Many of the great scientists were Catholics. Also, the so-called Galileo incident has been grossly misrepresented. So let's talk about Galileo for just a minute. And this was covered in a previous conference quite a few years ago, and I'm not going to spend much time on it. But the idea was that because Galileo came up with the heliocentric system, the church didn't like that, and so he was tortured, suppressed, his writings suppressed, and he was put in prison for the remainder of his life. Well, he was put under a comfortable house arrest. But Galileo had a tendency to annoy and get on the wrong side of the cardinals and church authorities because of his flippant comments. So it was more of a personal thing. But the point is, Galileo was preceded by a Catholic priest in Poland named Nicholas Copernicus. And Copernicus is the first one, at least in those modern times of the Middle Ages, that came up with the idea of the sun being the center of the solar system. And Copernicus was not limited or prevented from teaching that. So there's a lot more to the Galileo story than is presented. But what is interesting is that the legend of the persecution of Galileo didn't appear in any writings until the 1760s, more than 100 years after his death in 1742, I believe. 1642. So more than 100 years after he died, all of a sudden there was this myth created that he had been suppressed by the church who didn't want his theories to be promoted. But the whole thing revolves around this idea of condemning the church as being opposed to scientific progress. And my last topic is on Pope Pius XII, because again, chronologically, this would be the closest to our time. So the story, the myth, is that Pope Pius XII actually supported Hitler and did nothing to alleviate the sufferings of the Jews. Now, you've heard the term Russian disinformation. This is actually a case of real Russian disinformation. Let me quote. It seems to have been mostly forgotten that the campaign to link the Pope, Pius XII, to Hitler was actually initiated by the Soviet Union, presumably in hopes of neutralizing the Vatican in post-World War II affairs. Early in 1944, Izvestia, the official party daily published in Moscow, claimed that Pope Pius XII had supported the Nazi regime. The next day, the New York Times condemned the article as malicious propaganda and vigorously asserted the Pope's opposition to all forms of tyranny. But the Soviets continued, and one of their agents soon published a book claiming that the Vatican had signed a secret pact with Hitler. It was an absolute fake, embraced only by party liners and by professional anti-Catholic writers, of whom there were a surprising number in that era. Fortunately, the Soviet disinformation campaign was drowned out by a remarkable chorus of praise for the Pope coming from Jewish sources in the immediate aftermath of World War II. As they noted, Hitler had bitterly attacked the Catholic Church, had closed all the Catholic schools, and had arrested thousands of priests and nuns and sent them to Dachau and other death camps. As the world learned of the horrors of the Nazi death camps, Pope Pius XII was widely praised for his vigorous and devoted efforts to saving Jewish lives during the war. In 1943, Chaim Weizmann, who would become the first president of the State of Israel, wrote, quote, "The Holy See is lending its powerful help wherever it can to mitigate the fate of my persecuted co-religionists." Moshe Sharett, soon to be Israel's first foreign minister and second prime minister, met with Pope Pius XII during the last days of the war. Quote, "I told him that my first duty was to thank him, and through him, the Catholic Church, on behalf of the Jewish public, for all they had done in various countries to rescue Jews." Upon the Pope's death in 1958, Golda Meir, a future Prime Minister of Israel, noted his efforts on behalf of the Jews of Europe, calling him, quote, "a great servant of peace." Now, Pope Pius XII, some will say, why didn't he do more? When he would speak out against the Nazis, they would persecute Jews, minorities, Catholics even more. So he realized that his hands were tied, but he certainly had spoken out on a number of occasions. And then from that point, he began to work quietly to rescue Jews, to allow them to take refuge in convents and monasteries, etc., and did all he could. And what you might say is the best response to this lie is that the head rabbi of Rome, after World War II, converted, became a Catholic. And what name did he take at his baptism? Eugene. He wanted to be named after Pope Pius XII when he became a Catholic, which I think is amazing. All right, so those are 10 lies. There were more. But in conclusion, there are several lessons that we can learn from this study of apologetics. First of all, we should never be ashamed of the true history of the Catholic Church. We must love Christ's church, even though she is made up of imperfect members. Third, we should be ready to defend the church against distorted history. Fourth, always read historical works with a critical eye, on the lookout for propaganda. So being skeptical of what you read or hear. Don't just believe it because you read it on the internet or in a book. Always be careful and skeptical, especially if something sounds a little fishy. Fifth, promote good literature on the correct history of the Catholic Church. And in that regard, I would like to mention several sources that you could use. One of them is an internet site I haven't used very much, but it is called the Catholic League for Civil and Religious Rights, so catholicleague.org. The president of the Catholic League is a man named Dr. William Donahue. He is prolific. He puts up articles almost daily, and they're archived, years and years of articles. I've used it a little bit in the past. I imagine he is probably a member of the Novus Ordo, but very solidly Catholic in his thinking, and has written some very good articles defending the church against lies and misinformation. Now, there's a book that I have used called Bearing False Witness. The bishop gave me this book. The subtitle is Debunking Centuries of Anti-Catholic History. And what's interesting about this book, it was written by a non-Catholic. So Rodney Stark is a professor of history in Baylor University, which is a Baptist university in Texas, but he's a historian, and he was concerned about the lies that are told about the Catholic Church. So here he comes to the rescue, being a non-Catholic, although he may have converted, but he was raised a non-Catholic. And what's interesting about this book is that there are over 600 footnotes, and the bibliography is, I don't remember, 15, 20 pages long of all of these books that he read, and he gives the historians that promote the lie, and he gives the historians that tell the other side of the story. So it's an amazing work, and especially believable in that it comes from a non-Catholic who is just seeking the truth. But the last book that I'll mention is one that we have in our bookstore, and it's called 7 Lies About Catholic History. This is written by a Catholic, Diane Moksar, and it's an excellent book, and it's a very readable book, not too long, 150 pages or so, and very interesting, well written, and a good book that explains, again, the true history and what a Catholic response would be to someone who argues against the Catholic Church. Again, written by a Catholic with a good, proper Catholic understanding. I hope you've learned something. God bless you. Bye.